confess my sins to a priest.
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion here on EWTN. You know what this program is all about. It's a program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters, those of you who have questions about the Catholic faith and are trying to figure out how to get those answers you've been looking for. This program is just for you. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening outside of North America, please dial the number 1 and then 205-271-2985. You can also send us an email if you'd rather. The address for that is ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. Charles Beery is our producer. Matt Kabinski is our phone screener. Jeff Burson is on social media for us. If you want to ask a question via YouTube or Facebook, we are indeed streaming there right now. Look, I'm pointing at you. I'm waving at you. You're on. We're on. All you have to do is put your question in the comments box. Jeff will see it. He'll shoot it to us here in the studio, and we're off to the races. I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
Very well. How was your weekend, sir?
Oh, it was pretty decent. How about yours?
You know, it was all good. We went to an Epiphany party, which is a cool thing. They actually had gold, frankincense, and myrrh set out on the table.
Fantastic. I wondered if you could derive a tongue twister out of Epiphany party.
Possibly so. I'll be working on that. Well, I've got a great email to lead us off here. This is from Corey. Dr. Anders, I was speaking recently with an Orthodox friend, and our exchange went something like this. I said, do the Orthodox believe in venial and mortal sin? I know Catholics believe that going to Mass gets rid of venial sin. Not sure if the Orthodox had something like that for going to Divine Liturgy. He replied, well, attending the Divine Liturgy does not get rid of sin. This is a false teaching, although hidden through the craftiness of words in the Catholic Church. The Mass does not get rid of sin. The only time we are granted remission of sin is through consumption of Christ's holy divine body and precious blood. Your thoughts, Dr. Anders?
Okay, so I won't try to speak for the Orthodox so much in their doctrine.
Okay.
But I will say that there is a difference in tone between East and West on the doctrines of sin and salvation.
Okay.
And I mean, I think ultimately they're reconcilable because we're all part of one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and East and West are Catholic, it's not just Orthodox and Catholic, right? Catholics are also East and West, Eastern Rite Catholics,
Sure.
Western Rite Catholics. And Western theological language and law, it tends to be more juridical in the way that it frames the process of salvation. Justification is a forensic, a courtroom term, right?
Okay.
And our thinking about salvation and sin, it tends to be a little bit more, drawing a lot of distinctions and trying to sort of check a lot of boxes. That's kind of the caricature, but there's some truth in that caricature. And the Eastern view is typically not framed in terms of justification as much as it is in terms of the also biblical idea of theosis, of divinization, the transformation of the human person through participation in Christ, which is transmitted principally through the liturgy. And that would include participation in Christ's body and blood in the Eucharist, but also in participation in the act of worship itself. And so the Orthodox, in my experience, in my view, are less keen on drawing sort of hard and fast lines throughout the architecture of the spiritual life. They have a kind of more organic, fluid understanding of the individual's participation in the community and in the person of Christ, and they're not as keen to draw those distinctions. Now, that in terms of the specific question about how do you actually get rid of sin, well, I think in both East and West, the idea is that we should draw progressively closer to Christ and be more and more inflamed with His charity, and that just is how you get rid of sin. I mean, the way you expunge sin from your person is to fill up instead with the love of Jesus. Now, we can render that in a kind of technical vocabulary. We can talk about, forgiving sin and infusing sanctifying grace. But at the end of the day, or you can talk about it in terms of theosis, but at the end of the day, it's all about being filled up with the love of God and leaving no provision for the flesh. And the entirety of the Christian life is engaged in that project. So to isolate one moment, even something as central as the act of Holy Communion, as sort of the line in the sand that makes the difference, I think is artificial. It doesn't really reflect the dynamism of Christian life from baptism all the way to last rites. All of Christian life, our devotion to the saints, our veneration of icons, our life together with the people of God, our participation in all of the sacraments, the prayers of the liturgy, our openness to divine action in our lives. All of this is part of an organic development of the soul in Christ, being inflamed with his love and growing more and more like him.
Corey, thanks so much for your email. Here's one now. This is from BB. Do you think Judas Iscariot will be in heaven? After all, Jesus forgave the people that crucified him and nailed his hands with nails and feet. He said, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they're doing." Now, it's not the unforgivable sin, so do you think Judas will be in heaven?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. So the ordinary magisterium of the Catholic Church, meaning not a conciliar pronouncement or some infallible teaching by the Pope, but rather just the way the Church has handed on the faith down through the centuries consistently, to the extent that question has been raised by the Church Fathers or addressed in liturgy, the consensus is no, that Judas is not in heaven. And there are a lot of prayers in the liturgy and thoughts of the Fathers that basically single him out as a kind of example of the archetypical damned soul. And not because he betrayed Christ. That's actually not why. All of us can betray Christ and still be forgiven. It's because he died in despair, that he despaired of God's forgiveness and he killed himself. Yeah. Right? That's sort of he did have a horrendous sin, but rather than seeking reconciliation and forgiveness in humility, he just despaired of forgiveness and offed himself. That's really kind of the key issue. Jesus himself said of Judas that it would be better for him never to have been born. Yeah.
That's a tough statement. BB, thank you so much for your email. Appreciate hearing from you. If you'd like to send us an email for a future show, the address ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. In a moment, we'll be going to Daniel, a first-time caller just outside of Philadelphia. We'll also get to a question from Modesto via YouTube, Laura from Texas on YouTube, and there's lines open for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders on this Monday afternoon here on EWTN.
If it's central to the faith, you can find it on EWTN Podcast Central, featuring the best of EWTN radio, as well as faith-filled podcasts from our friends and affiliates across the nation, all in one place, all free. The destination for great Catholic audio programming is EWTN Podcast Central. It's like podcast heaven. Visit EWTN.com/radio/podcasts today.
For nearly a century, the National Catholic Register has been moving minds, moving hearts, moving souls, and enriching our readers' lives by spreading the truth of the gospel. Today, that tradition continues with award-winning journalism that goes beyond any secular news service, while bringing much-needed light and clarity to the issues and events that affect you and your family's future. All with faithful and courageous reporting guided by the teachings of the Catholic Church. It's more important than ever to join Catholics who depend on the Register. Get 6 free issues today online at ncregister.com/radio or call 800-421-3230 and mention code radio. That's ncregister.com/radio or call 800-421-3230 and mention code radio. The National Catholic Register. Read faithfully. Call to Communion here on EWTN with Dr. David Anders. If you have a question for him, then please do give us a call at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Are you up to date on everything coming from Rome? Well, with news from EWTN's Vatican Bureau, you can watch all the important events from Rome, even if you don't have access to a TV set. Using the latest technology, we've made it possible to watch the latest news from the Holy See, all delivered directly to your home via live streams. Watch live on EWTN's YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You will be up to date. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. We begin with Daniel, a first-time caller just outside of Philadelphia, watching on EWTN television today. Hello, Daniel. What's on your mind today, sir?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Go right ahead.
High school, I thought of this question. I started to think. I went to Bishop Egan Catholic High School, did 4 years there, a wonderful high school. And I thought of this then, and I'm talking 50 years ago when I graduated. Mm-hmm. And that question was this to myself. I had asked, if you believe in purgatory, if anyone believes in purgatory, aren't those people saying that Christ's sacrifice at Calvary was inadequate?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. No, they're not saying that. Here's why. We have to distinguish in the doctrine of redemption between the redemption objectively accomplished, what Christ did through his holy life, death, and resurrection, and then the application of that to our own subjective condition. It would be like saying, if you have an infection and a pharmaceutical company manufactures an antibiotic that can cure your infection. Mm-hmm. And you say, okay, here's the pill. It will absolutely cure your infection, but you have to take it as directed. Well, if I insist on following the take it as directed instructions, does that mean the pill is insufficient to cure me? No, it doesn't mean it's insufficient. It means you have to take it as directed. And the point of controversy between Catholics and Protestants is less about, is the sacrifice of Christ sufficient? We both agree it's sufficient, although we conceive of it differently. It's really about how do you take it as directed? And the Protestant view is that the way you apply the grace of redemption to yourself is by faith alone. That's how you do it. And the Catholic view is that it's faith, but it's faith and the turning of the will to God in charity. And that which itself is a work of grace, by the way, and as the Lord moves me to turn my heart back to him in charity, then what that means, what does it actually mean to love God and love neighbor and to seek to do God's will? It means that I seek to purify myself of those things that are contrary to God and expunge them from my personality. And that turning of the mind and heart to God, aided by divine grace, is the way that I derive the benefit from Christ's death. It's Christ's death that comes in. The power of his death flows into my life and makes that purification and that turning of the will possible. And purgatory is simply an extension of that penitential dynamic of what it means to turn to God in love and expunge from my personality those contrary elements. That's how the grace of God flows into me. That's the take it as directed, printed on the label of the bottle of Jesus' sacrifice.
Okay. Daniel, is that helpful for you?
Well, I'll be honest. I don't think he answered the question, and there was a lot of dancing around. And
excuse me. I'd love to answer it. If I didn't, I really want to know where I fell short. Explain how I missed it. Plainly thinking,
if a person believes in purgatory, and Christ died for everyone to save everyone's soul so they could get to heaven.
Yeah. Agree.
Right?
100% agree with you.
Okay,
Yeah.
I agree with that. I have Protestant and Catholic friends, and they agree with that. But I don't see how believing in purgatory enhances the sacrifice that Christ meant. It dehances it.
Okay, so explain why.
Because there's so much emphasis put on by the Catholics, put on purgatory and Mary, the Mother of God, and she and the Queen of the Universe, and all this.
So can you explain why that diminishes the value of Christ's sacrifice?
Oh, because you're putting so much stuff on purgatory. The Catholics are. So
why does that diminish the value of Christ's sacrifice?
Of course, because you're taking your eye off the ball. The ball your eye should be on is Christ's sacrifice.
Okay, let's go with that. Hold that thought. Okay, when we place our eye on Christ's sacrifice, what is the purpose of having our vision centered on the person of Jesus? What is the goal there? What are you trying to accomplish in centering your eyes on Christ?
You're trying to maintain salvation, have salvation.
How does centering my eyes on Christ help me to maintain salvation?
Following Christ's example.
Exactly. That's exactly right. You put your finger right on it. Absolutely. The point of focusing on the crucifixion of Jesus is that our lives could be conformed to the shape of his sacrificial life, that we give up of ourselves, that we be willing to suffer in imitation of Jesus, who gave his own life in love for his brothers and love for those he would save. And in our case, it also means, as St. Paul tells us, to make every effort to rid ourselves of everything that contaminates flesh or spirit out of reverence for God. That's 2 Corinthians 7, verse 1. So you're absolutely correct that the point of focusing on Jesus' sacrifice is to conform our lives to his, which includes the purification of our life from sin. And that's what purgatory does.
Daniel, we really appreciate your call. Thanks so much, and please call us another time. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Call to communion on this Monday afternoon here on EWTN Radio. Let's go now to Tammy, a first-time caller in Peoria, also watching on EWTN television today. Hi, Tammy. What's on your mind today?
I'm a new Catholic, and I do wear the head covering during Mass. But my friend made me a couple of smaller head coverings to wear on the top of my head every day. Are we allowed to do that? Because I feel closer to God when I'm wearing the head covering.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. There is nothing in the Catholic faith that would prevent you from wearing a head covering every day. There's no obligation to do that, but there's certainly nothing preventing it.
Totally up to you. Tammy, thanks so much for your call. We do appreciate that. Modesto sent us a question on YouTube on Friday. Total truth in advertising here. We couldn't get to it on Friday's show, and I hope that Modesto is listening today on YouTube. Here's what Modesto says. What is the soul? And what is the soul's part in relation to the mind and the heart as a system?
Yeah, thanks. So in Catholic theology and philosophy, the soul is simply whatever it is that causes a living being to be a living being, right? So if you just take an animal, for example. I've got a bunch of dogs and cats in my house. If one of them, God forbid, got run over by a car, I would now have a dead dog or a dead cat. Mm-hmm. What's the difference between a live one and a dead one? Well, whatever answers that question is just what we mean by soul. Now, in the case of an animal, you would say, well, there's nothing immaterial there, nothing eternal that makes the difference between a live dog and a dead dog. It would be rather the way the parts of the dog are functionally and structurally organized, to function as a living organism. Mm-hmm. And when that organizational structure is destroyed somehow, then you cease to have a living animal. So the soul is a material thing that refers to the arrangement of the parts that enables it to function as a living organism. And the same thing is true of a human being. What is it causes what's the difference between a live human being and a dead human being? Is this structural functional organization that allows the organism to function as a system. But there is a difference with a human soul from an animal soul, and this we can discern when we look to the nature of the human person and see that intrinsic to human activity, there is something immaterial, and that is abstract thought.
Yeah.
The functioning of the human intellect transcends the purely material, and it doesn't take a lot of thought to figure that out. Philosophers have known that for thousands of years. If I conceptualize the Pythagorean theorem, for example, I'm participating in something that's purely abstract. Yeah. There's no physical instantiation of that. I may be able to build a model that can rely on that fact, but it's something that's necessarily it's transcendent and universal and immaterial by its very nature. And so I'm participating by my intellect in universal properties and immaterial properties. So there's something about the human person itself that transcends the merely material. Now, your question, what is the connection of the soul to the mind and the heart? Well, if you consider the mind to be basically where cognition takes place, well, the Catholic position is the soul is what causes the human being to function as a human, and that means to function rationally. Mm-hmm. So there's a very intimate connection between the soul and our cognition. Heart, a lot of times in religious discourse, really refers to the seat of our affections. We're using a metaphorical sense, not talking about the organ in the body.
Right.
The Catholic doctrine and, I think, good neuroscience both confirm that that the affections are, the emotions are material things, right? And so, my ability to hunger or thirst or to long for, I mean, we know what the my mind has gone blank. The neurotransmitters are, right?
Okay,
Like
okay.
dopamine and so forth,
Yeah,
that work
yeah.
for human motivation and move in that way. And in classical Catholic philosophy, they call those the passions. And we recognize that animals have passions, even as humans do. So there's something that's different about the functioning of the passions from the function of the intellect. And yet the passions are the context in which the intellect does its work. I mean, try solving a geometric proof that you don't care about.
Huh?
Right? The intellectual activity is sort of parasitic, if you will, on those embodied, embedded biological, physical conditions from which the passions emerge.
Fascinating. Hey, thank you so much for your question, Modesto, via YouTube. Call to Communion here on EWTN. We do have a couple of lines open. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, this would be a great time to call 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you call right now, we can probably get you on today's show, just like we're getting to Mary in Irving, Texas, just outside of Dallas, listening on the great Guadalupe radio. Hello, Mary. What's on your mind today?
Hi, Dr. Anders. Thanks for taking my call. So my question is, when the wise men got to Jerusalem and they went to Herod, and the scribes confirmed that Christ was supposed to be born in Bethlehem, and I'm just curious, why did the Jewish leaders and the scribes not follow the three wise men to go confirm the birth of Christ? I mean, that's what they've been waiting for all this time, right? And isn't that what they're still waiting for? So I would think that when the three kings, great men from the east came and they said they were here to worship Christ, I would think that should have pushed them to follow them to go see. But they didn't. I'm just curious, do we know why they didn't do that?
Sure, yeah, I really appreciate the question. So Revelation is silent on the question that you've raised. I don't think there's anything in the sacred text that answers that directly, so I think we're left to our speculation. And here's what I would say. This is just my private opinion. I could be wrong. I don't think Herod had the slightest interest in paying homage to the Son of God and the King of Kings. I think all the evidence suggests that Herod's interest was entirely self-serving. He wanted to get this usurper out of the way, right? And that was his motive. I think with respect to the scribes, I think that the incarnation of Christ utterly confuted their expectations. So the only part of the birth story of Jesus that conformed to their expectations was the business about Bethlehem. Beyond that, nothing conformed, right? They thought of the Messiah as a royal personage who would have come with pomp and circumstance to defeat the Romans. The idea of a Messiah born in a stable and placed in a manger surrounded by animals was not their expectation at all.
At all. Mary, thanks so much for your question. Joanne, watching on YouTube this afternoon, says, do Catholics still believe you are saved by good works?
Well, I don't like the way the question is framed because it really doesn't capture the Catholic view of salvation at all, right? So the Catholic view is that our salvation is from start to finish a work of God's grace, and there's nothing that we can do to move the hand of God to give us grace. So even grace itself, the gift of grace is itself a grace. It's not like I'm sitting down here lost in sin and I say, I'm going to pull myself up and ask God for grace, and then God responds with grace. That's actually the heresy of semi-Pelagianism. Even my turning to God and asking for help is itself a sign of God's prevenient grace, that he's already come before me and moved my heart to desire him. So from start to finish, the salvation understood by the Catholic Church is a work of divine grace. What does grace do in me, however? Well, what grace actually effects in the soul is to turn the soul from sin to God. And so God is able to say to the soul that he graces, well done, good and faithful servant, because he has effectively turned the soul towards himself and caused it to become a vessel of charity. So in that sense, you can say of the Catholic Church that we believe that our salvation is by works, but only insofar as that they are works that God himself has worked within us. St. Augustine would say, Lord, you crown your own gifts in us. It's not as though, God is is a kind of objective, independent observer with a clipboard who's just marking off people's good deeds, bad deeds, good deeds, bad deeds, and he saves the people who have done the most good deeds. No, God is the shepherd who goes after the one lost sheep and then does everything to turn that sheep back to the flock and win them back to himself, and then reward the sheep for doing what it was told to do.
Great question, Joanne. Thanks so much for it. In a moment, we're going to be talking with Barbara in South Louisiana, also John in Columbus, listening on the great St. Gabriel Radio. Rob is listening in Omaha on Spirit Catholic Radio. A couple of lines are open for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Hey, what's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? Let's talk about that here on EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Stay with us.
"60 Seconds" with Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen.
If anyone is coming from God with a revelation for our reason and a strength for our will, reason is going to impose certain tests, and these tests are three. And they're tests that can be verified by reason and by history. First, whoever comes should be pre-announced. 2, he should work miracles in attestation of the fact that he is a messenger. 3rd, nothing that he ever teaches or reveals to us should be contrary to human reason, though it may be above it. Those are 3 tests. That's a standard. That's a measuring rod. First, we say anyone who comes should be pre-announced. After all, brides pre-announce their wedding. Automobile manufacturers tell us when a new model would appear, and if God is going to send someone to this earth, certainly the least that God can do is to let us know, I'm sending someone.
The people you know and trust are on EWTN.
Want to be notified when Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders goes live on Facebook? Follow EWTN Radio's Facebook page and click the bell icon to be notified.
By providing quality programming faithful to the teachings of the Catholic Church, EWTN is television that viewers can trust. Whether it's films, documentaries, news coverage, lively discussion shows, or kids programs, we highlight the truth that is the eternal Word. For a complete schedule of EWTN television programs, visit EWTN.com and click TV. EWTN, the Global Catholic Network.
Hi, this is Cy Kellett. Later today on Catholic Answers Live, Trent Horn. Why aren't you Catholic? Catholic Answers Live, 6 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio. Now, back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
Hey, we're glad you're with us on this Monday afternoon edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN. Before I give you the phone numbers, let me pass on a praise report that just came in from YouTube. GK is watching us. He says, I'm a long-time, or he or she says, long-time listener of Call to Communion, became aware of Dr. Anders years ago via the Call to Communion website, which we occasionally talk about. It is instrumental in my reversion to the Catholic Church. I used to be an anti-Catholic Protestant.
Oh, well, that's what Call to Communion, the website, was all about.
Yeah.
It was a bunch of anti-Catholic Protestants who'd become Catholic talking to a bunch of anti-Catholic Protestants.
So, yeah. And if you're interested in that, you can still check it out, calltocommunion.com. And that is not just you. That's a number of folks,
No,
right?
a bunch of us work for that.
Very cool. Here is Barbara now in South Louisiana, listening on the great Christ Our King Radio. Hi, Barbara. What's on your mind today?
Hi. When we pray some prayers, part of what we're saying is, Father, we offer your Son, Christ, to you, or whatever. Who are we to be offering God to his Father?
Great question.
Father? I don't get that.
Fantastic question. So in terms of the who are we to be doing this, we're priests.
Ah.
Every one of us baptized Catholics is a priest, and the office of a priest is to offer sacrifice. So don't ever forget that you're a priest. You're not a ministerial priest, the one who effects the sacrifice of the Mass and consecrates the Eucharist, but every Catholic is a priest, and the chief office of a priest is to offer sacrifice. So that's how we dare.
Okay.
Right? If you will, who am I? Well, I'm someone that Christ himself has made a sharer in his priesthood. Now, how is it that I actually do this? I do it in the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass. And again, you might say, well, isn't it just the ministerial priest who offers Christ in the Mass? No, that's not the teaching of the Church. Church teaches that the ministerial priest is the one that effects the sacrifice through the transubstantiation of the elements. But it is every priest in that room, and that includes all the baptized, who actually offer the body and blood of Christ to God in reparation for the sins of the world. Then St. Paul says in Romans chapter 12 that we offer our bodies as living sacrifices, and that this is our spiritual act of worship. Remember when Jesus said in John chapter 4, woman, you worship on this mountain and that mountain, but the Father seeks the worshipers who worship him in spirit and in truth. Well, the worship in spirit and truth is the offering of ourselves as living sacrifices, imitations of Christ's sacrifice. So as we join ourselves to his self-offering, we are, in a sublime way, participating in the offering of Christ himself to God the Father. So we offer him in the Holy Eucharist. We offer him in the sacrifice of our own lives, and we do this in virtue of being priests in the Church.
Barbara, is that helpful for you?
Yes. And okay, with that then, does that mean that's part of our job as priests to do that? I guess I just don't think of us. We're supplicants, and we're people who, oh gosh, I don't know how to say this. That helps a lot, but I think
your problem is you feel like you don't have anything worthy to offer to God. Is that the idea? Is that the problem?
Yes.
Okay, so that's exactly what Christ came to solve for us, right? But for Christ, that would be true. We wouldn't have something worthy to offer God. But because of Christ, we have two things of great value to offer him. First, we have Christ's very own body and blood in the Holy Eucharist that we offer to God. So we didn't create that. God gave that to us. And I like to put it this way. So when I was a kid, I was a Presbyterian, and they always passed the offering basket down the aisle. I didn't have anything to put in there. I was a kid. I was 4 years old. But my father would reach in his wallet and pull out a quarter, and he would hand it to me and go, here, put this in the offering basket. He gave me the thing I had to offer, and then I offered it. Did that mean it wasn't an offering? No, I really did offer it, but my Father gave me that which I offered. That's exactly what our Father in heaven does. He gives us the thing that we offer back to him. He gives us the body, blood, soul, and divinity of his Son that we then in turn offer right back to him. Now, the other thing that we have to offer to him is ourselves. Now, you said, I don't feel like I have anything of value to offer to him, but God takes a very different view of you, right? There is a popular saying that I have heard, you probably heard it too, on talk radio, where someone is asked, how are you doing? And the response is, better than I deserve.
Oh, yeah.
I don't like that saying. I don't like it at all right? Because it seems to me it does not convey the truth of the Catholic doctrine of the human person. See, the Catholic doctrine of the human person is that to the soul that is in the state of grace, and that would be you, the soul in the state of grace has fully met the demands of the divine law because the love of God has been poured into your heart. You are now a sanctified creature of God, a child of God, infinitely worthy, made holy. We talk about the holiness of one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And your life is of infinite value to God. Otherwise, he wouldn't have sent his Son to die for you and redeem you to himself in that way. And so I think the proper answer to the question, how are you doing, is not better than I deserve, but I have been made deserving. God has made me worthy. God has granted me that wherewith I can now merit eternal salvation. And I will offer, as St. Augustine said, God's own gifts back to him. Not because I in myself have something intrinsic to me, but I have what God has given me. The very life of God himself flows into you, the Blessed Trinity indwelling you, to those who love God. Jesus says, if you love me, keep my commandments, my Father and I will come to you, make our dwelling within you. So you have the Lord God dwelling within you, and you give God back to himself through your participation. That's infinitely worthy.
How blessed we are. Barbara, thank you so much for your call. That's a great question. Call to communion here on EWTN. A couple lines open at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Rob is a first-time caller from Omaha, listening on the Great Spirit Catholic Radio. Hey, Rob, what's on your mind today, sir?
Thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
I was calling about the Apostles' Creed. When we say that Jesus was died and buried and descended into hell, but he rose again on the third day, what does that mean that he rose again?
Right. It just means he rose. It just means he rose. So I understand the problem. Etymologically, it sounds like he rose once and then he rose twice.
Yeah.
That's the way the idiom seems to function.
Mm-hmm.
But that's just not what it means. This is an infelicitous English phrase, right, that captures the Latin resurrexit or anastasis in Greek. That just means that he got up out of the grave and ascended to heaven. Doesn't mean anything beyond that.
Okay. Appreciate your call, Rob. Let's go to John now. John is in Columbus, listening on the great St. Gabriel Radio. Hey, John, what's on your mind today, sir?
Hey, how are you?
Well.
David, what's your opinion or your understanding of purgatory? As I approach 80, I'm beginning to think very seriously that eventually, real soon, I imagine, it's going to be my turn. And
Sure. So I appreciate the question. So the Church does not dogmatically define the content of purgatory, merely its existence and its function. So it's left a bit to our imagination to suppose what actually happens there. And my opinion on the matter, plus I guess today at the right coffee shop, $8 will buy you a flavored cup of coffee. So you take it or leave it as you like it, right? But here's how I like to think about it, and this is a permissible way to think about it, and I could, of course, be wrong. And I'm going to draw on two Catholic texts for this idea. One of them is John Henry Cardinal Newman's poem, I should say St. John Henry Newman, Dream of Gerontius. And the other one are the visions of Catherine of Genoa in her dialogue. And here's the idea that I derive from those two texts. God is infinitely holy and beautiful in himself, lacking in nothing. And the desire of the human soul is to be united to him in charity and to experience this immediate intuitive vision of God that we call the beatific vision. But the eye of the soul, as it were, cannot see that beauty until itself is made beautiful. And the organ has to be adapted to the object. Even as, when the eclipse comes by, if you try to look directly at the sun, it's going to burn out your retina. So you have to use those special filters to see the eclipse, right?
Yeah.
In the same way, the eye of the soul, if you will, has to be adapted to the vision of the divine glory. Otherwise, it'll just burn it up. And we can see this in sacred scripture, I think, especially in Isaiah chapter 6, when Isaiah sees the Lord seated on a throne high and lifted up. It's not the real vision of God, it's just a theophany. But still, Isaiah says, man, I am toast. I am done. I am cooked. Put a fork in me and turn me over. I am not going to make it. I'm a man of unclean lips. What am I doing standing here in the presence of God? In the Dream of Gerontius, St. John Henry Newman imagines a soul arriving at heaven not fit for the vision of the divine glory, and he basically does a gainer off the diving board back into purgatory because he's not ready yet. He can't stand the light. He's not fit for him yet, right? And Catherine of Genoa has this idea as well, and it's the idea that the vision of God itself, this vision of just absolute merciful love, total goodness and truth, the vision itself is purifying. So the confrontation with the awesome holiness of God, if you're suited for it, is bliss and glory. But if you're not, like Isaiah, you go, ouch, and it burns and purifies you. And so it's the very love of God that's doing the purifying work in your soul to make you fit for him, right? And I like that idea personally better than the smoking fire pots with demons and pitchforks images that come from medieval art and poetry, right? It seems to me more consonant with the nature of God and the actual experience that the soul has of the holy even in this life. There is a novel by my favorite non-Catholic novelist, C.S. Lewis, called The Great Divorce, that captures this image in fiction, in narrative. And while there are aspects of the story that would deviate a bit from Catholic doctrine, in that he sort of thinks that everybody gets to go to purgatory. He has apocatastasis, sort of thinks that everybody could have the capacity to get saved in the end, and that's not really the Catholic position. But he imagines souls in hell visited by a bus. Bus comes with a bus driver, and anybody can get on the bus that wants to. This is just fiction.
Yeah.
And so a lot of souls get on the bus and they get taken up to heaven. But when they get off, they find out that they're so insubstantial that they can't even walk on the grass. That the grass is like razor blades to their feet. The heaven is so solid, so real,
Yeah.
and they're so ephemeral in consequence. And what they have to learn when they're there is how to be real, which requires them to shed their immoderate affections and their sins and their pride and their arrogance and their superficiality, which are often represented anthropomorphically. And as they do that, they begin to gain more and more solidity until they can endure the weight of glory. And some of the souls do and end up, entering into their eternal reward, and others decide that they don't want to go through that and they get on the bus and go back to hell, right? So again, that's just fiction and the aspects that deviate from the Catholic position, but it's a beautiful, I think, narrative description of the kind of reality that I'm talking about, like this confrontation with God that in itself can be both beautiful and wonderful or painful as the soul is more or less adapted to that experience. And there are other church fathers that have something like that in them. Gregory of Nyssa, for example, his view of epictasis, his understanding of eschatology would sort of point in that direction as well. So that's kind of how I see it. But hey, what do I know?
John, thanks so much for your call. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Be sure to join us tomorrow morning for More to Life with Dr. Greg and Lisa Popchak. Hey, are you struggling with unhelpful self-talk? What are we even talking about, a term like self-talk? Well, Dr. Greg and Lisa Popchak will help you develop a healthy and helpful mindset. Check it out tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. Eastern, right here on EWTN Radio. Let's go now to Pam, a first-time caller from Springfield. Which Springfield? Why, the one in Illinois, of course, listening on Covenant Radio. Pam, what's on your mind today?
Well, I have a doctor, chiropractor, very religious, wants to get people back into the church. But he said to me that he was not going to repeat, Lord, I am not worthy, because he feels that we are worthy, and it's a negative mindset because Christ died on the cross. And it's a negative mindset to people, and he's had a person say that they did not go to church anymore because they didn't feel worthy. And how do I explain to him that this is not something to put negativity into the mind to make you feel lowly and
Yeah, thanks. Let me ask you a question. Is your chiropractor friend, is he Catholic or Protestant?
Oh, he's Catholic. He goes to church every day.
Oh, okay, that changes the equation a little bit, right? Because if it were a Protestant, your challenge would be a little bit deeper because there's a vastly different theological vision about what salvation consists in. For a Catholic, we don't have a choice about this language because it's part of the sacred liturgy. I mean, this is what we say before we receive Holy Communion, and so to be obedient to the Church, it's necessary for us to use this language. And so his dissent from that is really to dissent from the teaching of the Church, and about a very profound matter, which is the celebration of divine worship. So that's very, very problematic. He's kind of making up his own religion and calling himself Catholic, and that's kind of not Catholic. As Catholic, you believe what the Church teaches, and you pray what the Church tells you to pray. Mm-hmm. Now, I would agree with him that there's a mindset, there's an approach to the Catholic faith that can be craven and fearful and scrupulous, where the "oh, woe is me, I'm just a terrible, awful sinner, oh Jesus, help, help," can be quite devastating to a person's moral development, psychological development, spirituality. So don't do that. Don't do that. Don't take it in that light, right? So I'll give you an example from my own life. I grew up in a fundamentalist, kind of puritanical fundamentalist religion that so strongly emphasized human depravity and our utter dependence on God that I understand very well what he's talking about, this sense that I'm just a miserable worm and I'm just this festering pustule of nastiness and I can do nothing of any kind of value. And while there's the proponents of that would seem to imagine themselves to be very pious, I think that it can induce a kind of spiritual lethargy where one feels like it is illegitimate to take any initiative in the spiritual life, but simply to engage, say, temptation or sin or the lack of virtue by these sort of desperate pleas to God to save me, save me, save me, without ever actually doing anything to pull myself out of the muck. And what I think Catholic faith and practice teach is that the way in which God saves us is precisely by empowering our wills to pull ourselves out of the muck. Like, it's the work of grace. It is God's activity in us, but he moves us to move ourselves. And what else would, say, something like the monastic discipline be about? Why do you think St. Benedict wrote his rule and prescribed all of this robust form of life for people to follow their entire life if it wasn't to keep them from falling into sin? Yeah. The rule of life is there to inculcate humility and virtue so that people don't sin. But to participate, you got to follow the rule of life. And that's, you may not be a monk, but that's true for lay people too. So let's say, maybe your problem, not your problem specifically, but one's problem, maybe one has a drinking problem. Well, you're never going to get over the drinking problem by going to a bar and sitting there with a scotch and soda in your hand begging God to make you sober. That's not going to get the job done, right? You got to quit going to the bar, right? Now, does that mean that I can't pray, Lord, I'm not worthy? No, of course I can pray that, but I'm not praying it in that kind of craven desperation like the Puritan who says I can do nothing on my own. I'm such a festering pustule of nothingness. No, God has him. I am asking for the grace precisely to empower me to do the thing necessary to get myself out of my problem. So our agency is intrinsically is intimately connected to the process of our salvation. That's synergism. That is, we cooperate in the work of our salvation. That doesn't mean we're nasty nothings. It means that we have a great dignity in our moral life.
Pam, we hope that's helpful for you and for your friend. Thanks so much for your call. Tom is listening in Oklahoma on the great Oklahoma Catholic Broadcasting. Hey, Tom, what's on your mind today, sir?
Well, hi. I was just wanting to, just out of curiosity, see what Dr. Anders, how did he interpret John 20:23 before he became Catholic?
Very badly. Very, very badly. So I mean, just from a look at just John 23 is whoever sins you forgive. Did you say 1 John 20:20 or John 20:23? Yeah.
No, John 20 verse 23. Which is often used to support the priest.
Sure. I'm just going to read it out loud.
Okay.
So yeah, even if you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you withhold the forgiveness from any, it is withheld. Yeah. Whoever sins you forgive are forgiven. Whoever sins you retain are retained. So as a Protestant, I interpret that quite badly, and I had nothing available to me other than the standard Reformation interpretation of this passage, which was that the minister of the church can pronounce God's forgiveness but not effect it. And so it's typical, say, in the Presbyterian liturgy where I grew up in, to have a prayer of absolution, where the pastor will say something along the lines of, if you're sorry for your sins, God forgives you. It's like a declaration that of God's willingness to forgive the soul that expresses contrition and desire for reconciliation. That always seemed thin to me. I mean, I knew the alternative was unthinkable because that led to the Catholic Church.
Oh no,
we can't have the Catholic, So, but I didn't have. I mean, I remember when I was in seminary, really studying this passage and reading the Reformers about it, and to a man, they took this declaratory view of the passage. They really thought that ministers could have a role. They even practiced confession for a while. Luther practiced confession for a while. Calvin had even a sort of role for it in his pastoral ministry. But it was the role of someone declaring a truth, not effecting a change. And it just seemed thin to me. I never was persuaded by it, but I didn't have a good alternative.
Okay. Well, there you go. Tom, thanks so much for your call. Bob in Pennsylvania asks, Dr. Anders, are James and Paul referring to the same thing when they use the term works?
Yeah, I kind of don't think so. I think, this is my own personal opinion, I think that when Paul talks about works, he has in mind those things that distinguish Jew from Gentile, right? So it's things like circumcision and the laws of kashrut, the dietary rules, that kind of stuff. And those things don't justify. It's rather the love of God poured into our hearts, whereby we love God and neighbor, that enables God to declare us righteous. And those sort of ceremonial precepts of the Mosaic Law don't really make us righteous. That's how I think Paul uses the word works. I think when James uses it, I think he's talking about moral behavior. I think he absolutely intends, like, you are justified. When God declares you just, it is on account of the moral behavior that you do in response to faith.
Okay, very good. And Bob in Pennsylvania, thanks so much for your question. Here's one now from Joe in Pennsylvania. Dr. Anders, St. Paul says that remaining single is the best path, generally speaking, and yet God says in Genesis that it is not good for man to be alone. This seems to violate the law of non-contradiction. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, absolutely. So keep in mind that between the created order that God established in Genesis and the teaching of Christ about the kingdom of God, we have a massive eschatological shift. In the teaching of Jesus and John the Baptist was repent for the kingdom of God is here. A fundamental new order has entered into human experience where our good is oriented not just to the temporal good of this world, but to eternity, something that Adam and Eve knew nothing about. And so it remains true that the temporal good of the human person is best served by procreation and childbearing and civil society and all the goods of this life. And those are appropriate aims. There's nothing wrong with those. But that if your aim is for eternity in the kingdom of heaven, then the celibate vocation is the superior way if you have that calling.
Okay, very good. And here's one now from Christine. If baptism is needed for salvation, and we baptize babies because of the stain of original sin, what do we say to those families who lose babies that are in the womb? Those babies were not able to be baptized.
Well, we entrust them to God's mercy and understand that He wants all to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. So we don't condemn them, and we entrust them to the mercy of God.
Okay. Appreciate that. Christine, thank you so much for your call, or your question, rather. Monica says, we did our best raising our millennial children, but their faith is weak. They seem to take issue with me wearing a veil, as I did not do this when they were growing up. So my question is, am I driving them further away by the way I practice the faith? That is, daily mass, rosary, etc. Thanks, Monica.
Okay. Personal opinion, take it or leave it, right? I would definitely distinguish daily mass and rosary on the one hand from veil wearing on the other, right?
Okay.
I wouldn't put all those in the same boat because the liturgy is so central to our experience as Catholics. And while the rosary specifically is not mandatory, some form of devotional life is mandatory. You have to have a prayer life as a Catholic. So those are non-negotiables. Your prayer life and your liturgical participation are non-negotiable. But I do think that if there's some non-essential activity that you're engaged in as a Catholic, some way, some style of Catholic life that is particularly noxious or a stumbling block to your children, you could follow the example of the Apostle Paul. And Paul absolutely adamantly refused to make circumcision mandatory for Gentile believers, and yet when it came to an issue of being able to reach his confreres or his compatriots in the faith, the Jewish people, he insisted that Timothy be circumcised, right? He was willing to, since he considered it a thing indifferent, not essential to the Catholic faith, he could circumcise or not circumcised according to the spiritual needs of his contemporaries so that he could reach them. He says, I try to become all things to all people in the hopes that I might reach some. So, I'm not big on tattoos, but if I had to get a tattoo to reach one of my children for the gospel, I might think about doing it. I don't want to. And so far, that hasn't been an issue. That's a non-essential, right? I'd be willing to give up the non-essentials for the sake of the essential.
Sounds good. Thanks so much for your question, for all these great questions. Glad we could get to so many emails today, phone calls, texts, YouTube questions. It all comes together on Call to Communion. Dr. David Anders, thank you, sir.
Thanks, Tom.
We do this program Monday through Friday here on the network. All you have to do is tune in 2 p.m. Eastern for our live or 11 p.m. Eastern for the encore. On behalf of our fantastic team, I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders. Looking forward to our next visit. Hopefully that'll be tomorrow right here on EWTN's Call to Communion. God bless.